All right. Welcome to the 21st call for the Wharf project. I'm going to do probably some quick updates, and then the majority of this call, we're going to dive into table-related stuff and querying tables, because we've spun our wheels quite a bit on syntax-related stuff for tables and are going to be seeking some additional feedback on how we do this, as well as maybe reaching out to try to get some information about primary indexes. But I guess to start with, big updates are that, the table stuff that I was just mentioning, and then documentation, which we shared in the Telegram channel last week. This documentation repo has been getting a lot of content injected into it. I think it's docs. We also have some placeholders, well, not placeholders, but actual development coming in on the documentation so far. The navigation still needs a little bit of work, but all of this documentation is going to be fed into the website. Just as a quick preview of this, we have kind of all of the topics down the sidebar. We're still working on organizing them. There's going to be a filter on the top. So if you are here and you're like, I need an API client, you can quickly get to something like that. Or if you need the peer-to-peer client or an asset or whatever it is you're looking for. A lot of the documentation is coming together. It's going to be filled with code examples and breakdowns of how all of these components work. You'll notice this is the actual core library documentation. Which is, I guess, under the Wharf umbrella right now. We're finally going to have that documented, so you'll be able to look at stuff, see the integer stuff, dive into all the mathematical operations that most people don't even know exist within these things, and really start unlocking some of what that core framework behind all of this is going to be able to do. Show you what the WharfKit stuff looks like, but the navigation is broken right now. It doesn't know how to navigate the folder structure that we used, so it just repeats itself for every file. Good times. But yeah, website is coming together. We're hoping in a couple weeks time we'll be able to publish a first draft of this. It probably will not be completed, but it will have the documentation site, it'll have a homepage, it'll have kits, we'll still have the blog, the brand, links to GitHub, stuff like that. So yeah, this is where a lot of our it's development effort, but extra effort is going into right now is just defining all of this. So if you poke around on GitHub, again, in either the website repo or in the docs repo, it's just WharfKit docs for this. They are starting to fall into place, and still a lot of writing to do and a lot of proofing and editing and things like that to make sure that it actually all makes sense. But we're going to build this in a way that when you're reading documentation, if you know something's wrong on one of those pages I was just showing, there will be links that you can jump over here to, contribute to the documentation itself. So yeah, that's kind of the big thing besides the contract kit. So if there's any feedback or questions or anything about the way that documentation and the websites are coming together, we are very open to that. I know it's not super exciting, and it will we'll be getting feedback probably once it's live, because then people will actually start using it. So that's kind of where that side of the project is. Other things besides the table stuff, since that's probably going to dominate the remainder of the call. The 5th milestone was completed, which was the session kit and kind of all of its critical plugins. We went through with the ENF, reviewed all that stuff over since our last meeting. The coalition has approved it is completed. The payment was released. So we're moving into the next milestones. So progress is being made. The next milestone, I believe, is actually, at least sequentially, is related to the contract kit and the account kit. So those will probably be a couple weeks out, if not, some point in July, we'll at least have something for everybody to be playing with, and then we will do some iteration with the community and do some feedback rounds to just improve that overall. We don't want to just completely develop it in a bubble and drop it out and not have anybody like how it actually works. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of packing everything else in the front of this call besides the table discussion. So maybe I take a moment here. Does anybody have anything else that needs addressing or questions, comments besides the table stuff?
I know you had mentioned that there were possibly changes to some of the code based on the documentation. Did that come to fruition?
The commits are there. We haven't published a release with them in it yet, though. I think they should all be on GitHub. What was that?
So there was changes to the code.
Yes. Or maybe they aren't pushed up to GitHub yet, or maybe they're in a different branch. I will have to look at where those are. It's mainly some reorganization of how parameters are passed. So not...
That's what I was expecting.
Yeah, not groundbreaking or anything.
Well, I mean, potentially breaking.
Yeah. Yeah, some reorganization of stuff. I will push those real quick, so at least they're visible.
This is still sub major, right?
Yes.
So what's going to get pushed up without a minor?
At this point, it might actually be the 1.0 release. Like, okay, these changes might come in the first major version, so people can at least expect breaks.
All right, perfect.
And it's been a little bit. The session kit initialization, this looks like one of them. So like, there's going to be 2 arguments, I believe, now to establishing a session kit. Yeah, we're going from just 1 object to 2. And it'll be the first one is required. The second one, everything in it is optional. And then I think there might be some other changes like that in some of the other commits. The UI option, it would have thrown an error if you didn't include it anyway. So now just programmatically we're requiring the UI. So nothing groundbreaking, but just things that we've observed while writing the documentation. Ooh. Spicy breakfast, catching my voice off guard. Cool. Was there anything else? Session kit, document, website. Cool. Well, then we will kind of dive into the meat and potatoes of what this call is probably going to be about. Tables. Switch to this tab. Contract kit. It's still private for some reason. We should probably just make it public. But the vast majority of the work has been happening on this branch, if it'll ever load. GitHub has had some weirdness over the past couple days. And we will jump into the tests just to kind of highlight how it works right now, and then dive into one of the discussions that's been ongoing. I am not in the tests yet. Let's shrink that down. I think we've looked at this maybe a little bit on some of the other calls. Just as a preface, this is kind of the syntax for manually establishing a table within the contract kit right now. If you load or programmatically have a contract generated, this will be done for you. So this is very much just kind of like if you dynamically wanted to load a table, this would be one way to do it, but we don't expect this to be the syntax that most people use. Most people will have, instead of manually creating a contract, instead of manually creating a table, they will have a contract object. The contract object will have an array of tables within it that you can just access, and they will be functionally the same thing as if you did this. So just as a note to that. You can see we're specifying what contract it's from and the name of the table. And then we also have to give it an API client because it does not have one by itself. It needs to know how to connect to the chain and get data, retrieve the API, do some other things like that. So that way we can dynamically deal with that stuff. We just have a mock client. It's an API client from core or from the Antelope library. And we're using EOS in these unit tests. So we have changed things a little bit so that there are cursors that come back. They are not asynchronous. It kind of, you're establishing almost it is a cursor. It's kind of like a query. You can see the syntax we're using right now. We have where, we have find, and we have all, I believe. We'll kind of get to those here a little bit. And then the syntax on the cursor right now is next. You call next, and this is the asynchronous function that actually performs the table calls. And in this example, you can see we're using the Decentium contract itself is something that our team is familiar with, and it is a rather advanced contract. So we've been kind of focusing a lot of testing there on our use cases, essentially. Like we have things like secondary, tertiary indexes on it. It has variants, it has types, it has tables, actions, it has everything. So a lot of the system contracts that we started testing on, like you can see we were using producers and name bids for some things as well. These tables don't have that advanced or that more complex usage. So we needed to start leaning on a different contract to actually test those features. So if there's any questions about like what those are in relation, I know you guys are probably aren't as familiar with that contract, but feel free to interrupt and ask if it comes up. So kind of jumping back to the actual thing, we're using the trending table, which is a trending data set of posts on that contract. One of the indexes is the ID of the posts in this table, and we're querying from ID to 5 to 6. You can see that the cursor, when you call next and then you map through the array, it is returning rows 5 and 6. If you call next on the cursor again, it's not going to return anything. It's just going to be an empty array. Like there was no more to this query. If there was actually more happening, you would get more results. You know, like if you were limited by either the API or by your limit call. More examples of this, like you can query by score. So score is another index on the trending table, and we're querying between those two score ranges. One of the other operators on the table query is all, or on the table cursor, sorry. So up here we're calling next, which just gives you the next, it'll do one query and it'll return the results for that. Down here we're calling all, which this is a recursive table query. So let's say you query, actually, I probably have an example of this down below. Yeah. Next. Well, this is a better example to show that. So we're saying on the name bid table, the name bid table has tons of records, right? On the cursor, we're calling next. And in this example, since we asked for the first what, that's 100,000. We're just saying give us as many as you can in this query. And when we queried the API, it returned 3,975. Our unit tests cache the results. That way this is repeatable. The API returned that amount of records, not because we asked for it, but because that was what was the execution limit of that get table rows call. So since the query itself is actually asking for more than what we returned, if we call next again, it's going to return more records. So now on the flip side of that, like I was trying to show above, is if we say give us, the number is different, but same result, give us the first 10,000, and then instead of calling next, you call all. This call is going to make multiple get table rows calls until it fulfills your request. So there are, like, I don't know how many exactly happened in this backend request, but you can see it actually returned all 10,000 rows. It might have done 3 or 4 API calls because the cursor was told to call all. Same with
Wouldn't you want to have a, like I assume here, obviously it stops whether it reaches your limit or reaches the end of the table. But wouldn't you want to also potentially add like a timeout or something to just kind of kill it if it goes too much?
I think there may be a timeout. There might not be like an iteration timeout, but core itself, the API client does time out after a certain amount of time. So would you be looking for like some sort of like max iterations?
Yeah,
or do you think that fits your need?
Or even max. Like I'm trying to think about it just to avoid someone like writing something that would just kind of, screw over their software.
Yeah.
It's not really for me. It's more for like, people are gonna see all and they're gonna make it easy, right? They're gonna be like, oh fuck it, I'm not gonna use low block or whatever it was called, like to kind of limit the responses by passing more parameters, and they're just gonna use all the time, and it's just something to try to find and stop people from doing that and abusing APIs.
Yeah, this against a lot of APIs, this could get you could run into rate limits if you started using this, and then the requests are going to start failing. And that, I guess, one thing we're going to have to note down is if recursively
response.
Yeah.
If it's a rate limit, try again or something.
Yeah, we're going to have to make it throw an exception or something to break out and then say, like your query is whatever the API responds with, whether you're being rate limited or there was too much data or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's an await anyway, like the user can easily handle that.
Yeah. No, that's a good feature to add in here. I don't think maybe backend scripts would tend towards using all because they want to build like a complete picture of the table. But I don't know if front-end applications necessarily would, because I think for front-end applications that are paginating, like I imagine like you're only going to show 50, maybe 100 things on the screen to the user before you start paginating yourself. And then you can use your own application's pagination to kind of match up with the limits themselves. And
I think you underestimate the variety of developers out there.
It's very possible.
Somebody's going to be like, oh, great, I'll grab all the, whatever accounts table in ESL.token and then just have it all in my state. And then I can filter through it and do anything.
Exactly. And then try to save it in local storage.
Yeah, or even start with a small account that just like, adapt is going to build their UI. And then if it gets popular, the contacts from or the tables will just grow humongously. And that all will have a varying expected results, so to speak.
Yeah. Do you have any, I guess, out of this conversation, any recommendations then for a better way to approach this?
I would say like maybe a time-based timeout or something that's, automatically enforced on cursor.all. Unless, for example, like, I don't know, like don't spend more than like a minute or whatever amount until you get all the results, or just
and the same thing for first as well. Yeah.
That makes
sense. But somebody can override it if they want to abuse, but they like kind of like, they plan to do that, so to speak.
At least it's something that they know what they're doing enough to disable that flag.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and realistically, like I think that the execution time should be somewhat low. Not a minute, that's for sure. Maybe even like a second. Because you can do 4 or 5 calls per second. I mean, against promptly responding API and retrieve 10, 20,000 records pretty easily.
Are these I guess you can't do this in parallel, right? You have to do each one synchronously.
Yes.
Because
we're using
You need to grab the next parameter from
the next key
the last
parameter.
result.
That's annoying.
Yeah.
It would be nice if you could
But
do it
how
in
does
parallel.
cursor.all work currently? So like you have to first do first, and then you can do .all?
So that is a good way to jump in. The cursors themselves have methods. You can use first. You can actually just call and get a cursor. Like the cursors themselves don't make API calls. They kind of set up the object to make API calls. First, there's find, there's where, like you can see we're doing table.where.
Maybe more to my specific question was more like, in these examples, you're specifying, you're really just telling it what's the maximum you want, but then how does it figure out, I guess it just puts that maximum and just takes whatever the API returned, and then, okay, never mind, like, it's not an issue.
Yeah, and then there's next and all are parameters on the cursor. And they're available on all of them. So like you can see, this is the test suite for the first call. So we're using the cursor. We're getting a cursor by calling first in all of these. And then you can either use next on the cursor or all on the cursor. And the same can be done with where. You can where on the table, and then we're using all on the cursor, or we're using, is there a next in here? Yeah, next is down here. We're using where on the cursor and then, or where on the table and then next on the cursor. So there's kind of 2 levels here. One of them is the table, and then the other one is the cursor. And each one have their own methods that are individually named.
That's very good.
And then there is an all on the table. Like here, you can see table rows, name bid table all. This will return all table rows recursively from that table. And again, that is kind of
And how does...
What was the question?
I was going to ask, how does this work with scopes? Like you're defining here a scope, or you're iterating over the scopes, or? That's
the next part of the conversation, because we are talking about changing the way this works right now. And I guess we jump into that, because right now it doesn't handle scopes, which is part of the problem. It's not letting me scroll up to the top of this page. And I should probably open that in a new tab.
Do you know even if like Leap itself supports like a request? Like I just didn't check. Like I know Diffuse does the REST API, where you can specify as part of your GET request, like just like, up to 1,500 scopes at a time.
I think you can only do 1 scope with the native APIs. It's just a string parameter.
Okay.
Interesting that I think Diffuse probably is watching in real time, and then you just have an array of scopes, and that's why they're able to do more than 1. So it's less of a query and more of a filter. I don't know a lot about Diffuse though, so I can't necessarily speak to that.
But it would be useful, like having something where you're passing multiple scopes. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that working on this. Like we've already, I think last night came up with one request that we want to make to the ABI definitions. Like I don't have to get into the details of that right now. The point is that I think by starting to really work with table data in a framework like this, we're going to come up with things that we may ask to be changed in the APIs themselves, because we're discovering things that we can't do with the APIs. So we can't write like easier abstractions in the code to be able to do. So hopefully that work on this and the feedback we collect and everything like that will then lead to ways that we can improve the APIs that are actually offered, the REST APIs, to enable us to do more cool things in the SDK layer. But like right now, we're starting to bump into the limitations of what the actual APIs are capable of. So yeah. Scopes is definitely one of those things. And to kind of walk this back a little bit on how you deal with scopes, you can see like on where is how we deal with indexes right now. And we pass the name of the index and then a query for it. This didn't really lead us anywhere that we could deal with scopes, because you could use a scope alongside of this. So currently, I'm going to switch tabs over to our discussion. We'll go down to the bottom. This
you did like .scope by or something.
This is kind of the proposed way we're talking about changing it, because there's a few things here. You also can't query by the default index in this way. Like, what if you just wanted to query by whatever the default index is on this table, right? You have to specify a name here to be able to use from and to. So in this kind of proposed change to this, and I think the reason we're bringing this up on this call is because we're looking for feedback before we go implementing this, because this is going to be a fairly large change to the code base itself. We're thinking about dropping the index by default, so that way you are just specifying from and to if you want to use the default index. And if you want to specify a specific index, you add an index into the object. This query, we're just doing where, and then from and to are at the high level, specifying index of score. Am I focusing? Yeah, okay, I'm focusing on the right window. If we go back here to this example, this is the current syntax for that. It's a object where the key is what matters. And the reason we're kind of
much better, I think.
Then you like the new one better?
Yeah, like instead of nested objects, and the idea is, you get the option now to have like optional fields with defaults, like in this case, the index.
And this is also to solve for scope. And then you could also pair scope with index. That's the reason we kind of started to shift in this direction. I didn't switch screens. So you can do an index like we were talking about, but then you could also do a scope. And then since index isn't specified, it would use the default index. It would basically be this query, except with a scope. And then you could combine both of them in the same query. You could use a scope and an index. So in this comment, you can also see the actual curl call being made to that table. So in this one, we're using scope, specifying it. We're giving the lower bound and the upper bound, which is the to and the from. And then we're specifying the index position of secondary and the key type. Like all of that's being done automatically based on the usage of the scope and the usage of the index. And we can still do IDE auto-completion for what the indexes should be, because we can see those in the ABI, and then, like we can hint as to what's available here. Scope, we're not going to be able to do that for, unfortunately. Like scope, you're just going to have to know, because I don't think the ABI itself actually offers that information.
No, it can't have it because oh, I guess you mean by what field name, like the scope, like what
Yeah.
field it applies to.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it has that. Don't recall.
This is some of the stuff we're running into. If you know of a way to detect what the scope would be based on the ABI, like we can't find it, so we can't like type this field right now. And we also
only the smart contract.
Yeah. And the same thing exists with the primary key. When you are doing, like on the producers table, if we went and looked at the ABI for the producers table, there is no indication that there are any indexes on this table. The index key and index type arrays in the ABI are empty, but somewhere in the code, it defines that the owner field, which is what these will query against, is the default index for that table. So
that's part of the improvements that ideally will happen in the ABI generation of CDT.
Yep. So we're kind of collecting a list of this kind of stuff that we hope to propose and have changed maybe at some point in the future. I imagine that like the one we're talking about specifically with scope and index, those would be CDT changes or people voluntarily starting to add that information into their contract or into their ABIs. But right now, like we're running into that wall where in this query, we don't know that from is a name type. Like it's just not something that we can predict, so we can't type this field.
But also the system contract might need updating to know how to parse that new fields in the ABI.
Not
sure. Like for return value, I remember it was needed to update. Or I'm not sure. Maybe it was actually you just needed to update CDT. Yeah, actually, I think it's fine because the ABI is not really used like for like when you're actually running things on the chain.
That's true. I guess a question for you guys that are more familiar with smart contract development. I'm jumping over to the system contract just to show this as an example. If we look for producer, I can't type. If we jump to the producers table, this is what I was talking about these arrays being empty in the ABI. In a contract where these are defined, is the first one the default? Or is the first one listed in these arrays the secondary index?
I was actually looking through this before because I had a question internally about whether secondary indexes were even registered in the ABI. And I can't seem to find a contract which has any of those filled.
That's one of the reasons we've been using this Decentium org contract is we actually do have secondary indexes on these. Like if I go to the trending table, Johan on our team is the one that built this before he even joined GrayMass. But you can see, like we know the index type of the primary index is defined as an integer 64. Like we know the type of index. We don't know the name of it. But since we wrote the contract, we know the name is ID, and that is a uint 64.
Are there 3 secondary indexes for this?
Yes.
So then that makes sense that each one of these corresponds with the index position.
That's what we're wondering is if this is actually like maybe the primary index and the secondary index are actually
well, I don't think this is saying that it's a secondary index. I think this is just in the case where there is secondary indexes, which I don't know if to consider this a bug or not, but in the case where there's secondary indexes, it looks like it pushes the primary index there into this list, reflecting it. And then everything else is ordered.
Yes, like what you're saying is like basically if it has more than one index, it does
populate
fit
them
all
all.
those fields correctly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's a bug.
This one kind of contradicts that, unless it's because a name is an N64. But it's like posts have, like, I guess I can just jump to.
Yeah, seeing the code for this would be great.
I don't know where that's at. I will have to ask Johan about that. I was just going to jump over to the table itself. If we look at the posts table.
But you can't have, can you even have a secondary index with a name as the type?
I believe so. There's a couple variants of.
I think there was some change like a year ago, if I recall correctly, that allowed different than before. I remember you had like one type you could use or something.
Well, I know there's UN64, I think there's 128, and then there's the checksums. But I don't know if you can use, I guess maybe it's coalescing it into like an I64.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, now we can.
Sorry, I was having internet issues. I've been meaning to speak for like the last 5-10 minutes. But
Sorry about
yes,
that.
I do think that names use indexes. I think you can convert them to I64, and that's what's happening. And like I did test this, like the first index on the list is the primary one. So yeah, like when you look at the list of key names, you're looking at primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on and so forth. And like the only issue from can we just always have a list in the API that would allow us which index to be used whenever a user is using the
As in the naming of it.
for our developers. Yeah, like what's the name of the primary index? Like if you could that information from the API that right now, like with the interface that Aaron was showing earlier, and I think you guys might have talked about this. I'm sorry for bringing things up a second time, but Aaron laid out this new interface. Like you won't developer for the primary index unless a secondary index is also defined.
Can you
Yeah, I'm sure it's on Nathan's notes to bring it up as a potential bug.
It is, but I'd love to have a community facing effort here. If you guys can create a ticket which explains this, I will bring it up internally.
Awesome. And just for reference, I brought this up. These are the recognized key types we have for the get table rows call. You can see it up top of what you can use for keys right now. Like these are all tested throughout the core/antelope library.
For secondary indexes.
Yes. Yes. Because you would have to manually specify these. So you were, I guess earlier you were saying that the primary index has to be like a variant of an N64 or a 128 or something.
I think primary is locked to 64.
All right.
I'd have to check that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I would tell from our side. I guess maybe even the default. Well, it's not in here.
If it's not, I have some docs to change.
We're all learning the intricacies of this wacky API call. Cool. So didn't mean to veer too far off of that. Yeah, we'll have to, we're starting to assemble kind of a short list of some of these challenges that we're running into based on really trying to abstract this stuff out of get table rows. But to jump back, I guess before I jump around, was there any other thoughts on that index topic?
No, just if when you do create a ticket, just ping me about it, please.
Will do. Cool. Daniel, were you trying to say anything when I was kind of showing this new syntax either? Like, I'm trying to walk back if you said you were trying to speak.
I wanted to say something when you mentioned the scope, because we can actually have the scope on the other, with the other UI or the other interface as well, which is as one of the fields. The issue is just the default in the case where you have a secondary one. That's the reason why we this discussion about just allowing developers to just put whatever the primary index is, like for find and where, not needing to actually specify the. Like I still like this this current setup, but right now we just don't have a good way to know like what the primary index would be when the secondary index is not there. So like that new system or that new interface that you're proposing, I think at this point at least makes way more sense. But it sounded like I missed a part of the conversation, but it sounded like you guys mostly like if I understood correctly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've
The nesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in any case, like we can go for this, and once we get those the primary index name and type, then we can just we can start offering those function typing, which will make the developer experience better. Cool.
I also we didn't bring this up, but I think the reason that we kind of started down this rabbit hole was that, where am I at? Here, like when we use this syntax, it almost feels like you could specify more than one of these and do like filtering on multiple fields at the same time. You know, like this syntax would make sense in that regard from a query language, because then maybe you did score from to, and then you added a second line that was something else with a from and to, and you could, you know, like this object makes it feel like you can have more than one. But then that was very much reinforced as soon as we started discovering, you know, that we don't even know what the primary index is from a code generation standpoint, or from the dynamic loading of the table standpoint. Like the ABI just doesn't define that. So
yeah,
cool.
I mean, it'd be nice if we could actually have more than one index used at the same time, but I don't think that's something coming.
That would be nice. But yeah, but then maybe it would still be better if you do where as maybe an array of objects. This feels cleaner if we can enable that at some point.
True. And I think we've talked about this internally a little bit too, is that like this could be a base layer syntax, and then in the future we could always expand upon this syntax to do something that maybe is a little bit more dynamic, like what we originally proposed, where, you know, it's score is the key name and then an object with the from and to. But just at like a core level. Those? What was that?
Those, like, say if you use this structure, can you do where, you know, whatever, and then do another dot where? Because that would be like also another way to enable chaining, or to enable, like, you know, passing multiple conditions.
Yes, that might be a possibility. Currently it's going to return a cursor immediately, so it wouldn't actually work. Like you could chain and immediately query currently, but you're right. Maybe at some point this could change into a chainable thing. I mean, we can't even do it at the API layer yet, so I don't know if we should necessarily do that immediately, but that is a viable option.
I mean, it's an option where you don't break
Yeah, I mean, it can
like
be
in the future if you want to do it.
Yeah, yeah. And also right now you can already do it for scopes and like for a scope and for the indexes. Like producers table where from Aves Nation to Team Greymass. And then you could add another where to that and have scope and whatever scope you want. And that could work right now.
Like would it execute at .where, or would it execute once like the full chaining finishes?
Where doesn't execute the cursor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's later when you call the all method or the next method that the actual requests happen.
Yeah, I personally like that approach.
Yeah, we can do that.
We'll have to. I'm thinking about that right now, and since the where method is on a table and the where method returns a cursor that you couldn't currently chain, we would have to make the where method return a table at that point. So that way you could call where on a table, which returns a table, and then you could call where on the table again and like mutate it. If that.
I mean, you have the cursor have a where method. Just,
True. That might be possible.
Yeah, because generally you want your execution at the end, not like called and then you do another thing, because then like it defeats a bit of the purpose.
Yeah. I definitely think like we're not talking about
more
removing.
Like I'm saying, like to make it so that because like you said, it's not necessarily like the best use of time now due to limitations of the API, but just to work with something that could be expanded in the future. Like not necessarily chain now, but the idea that maybe you can chain to add more things that are become available, for example, without breaking old code.
Got it. That does make sense. Designing with it a little future proofing in mind for maybe features that could come down the road.
Yeah, especially for something like this, like a library like this that I expect would be used in every dApp,
Yep. Cool. And feel free to jump back to this if there's any other thoughts or whatever. But I also figured I would just jump down here. This is the kind of proposed syntax changes for find, which we didn't really look too deeply at over here in this tab. Currently, find is not a cursor. Find is a way to immediately query. Like it is asynchronous. It is kind of the odd duck out in this situation. It's to return you a single row, like by a specific index. Like it is where you set, if you're using get table rows today, it's the query that you set lower bound, upper bound, limit 1. You want 1 row, and you're setting all these extra parameters to be able to do that. So currently it's that same syntax that we're proposing we change. Where we're specifying the key name and the value, we're kind of key pairing it. And then in this kind of proposed change, we are going to make it so that it is just a string, because again, we don't know what the primary index is. So instead of this being an object with ID : or in this case, it would be owner. Owner is the primary index on this table. It would be owner : Team Greymass. Now it's just a string. But if you wanted to find by a secondary index, you still just pass a string. So that way it's backwards compatible, or a valid data type. In this case, it was 5. And then you can pass the index or the scope as a secondary parameter to be able to look, to find this 1 row. This one was against a Delphi table, the Delphi Oracle contract table. You can find by ID against a specific scope. And then you can see in this query, we're looking for that ID and we're setting the scope based on what that was passed in. We're setting the lower bound, we're setting the upper bound, and that's how you would essentially do this query. And then for finding, you could also combine the two, just like you would in a where or a all call. Or no, not all. All doesn't accept a query. But I'm assuming
an option to get, like, if you do find and you just pass like I don't know, like the scope, like say I want to get the last row, like for example in the case of Delphi Oracle, how it works is like after submission, each row when you submit calculates like the median. So if you want like the latest kind of median with all the, with a little cutoff of any potential bad actors, you just get the last row and you grab that median value from it. So is there a way basically to get just like the last row in the table, so to speak? Or the first row in this case?
You just
don't pass no block or anything, and you just do like get table, if I remember correctly.
Right. I see the use case. Is that possible right now with a get table rows call?
Yeah, I think you just add the limit as 1, and you put the scope, and you don't pass any low block or whatever it was called, like limits.
Yeah.
Like you set the limit to 1, and you don't pass the other kind of optional fields.
I think that's where you would use first. But is it actually the first row of the table, or is it the last row of the table that you're looking to retrieve?
I don't remember off the top of my head for this one, but I remember when I was working with it, like when I want to grab, say, for example, like the current EOS USD price, I do a call like that with limit 1, and that way I'm grabbing the latest addition. And I think it would be I'm not sure which row it would be, but I would imagine the first if you're putting a limit of 1.
I don't know if that's possible right now. I know we can grab the first record using like switching tabs again. If you were to use,
I think first, of course, like
you'd be able to use where, and then, or you'd be able to say where and then specify limit 1 and call all or next, and it should return that first row. But there might be a nice helper method we can implement here. Oh, maybe that would work too, unless it is the last row, and that's kind of where I was getting stuck asking questions. There might be some value in having like a last call if there is a way to iterate over and get the last record. Yeah, there should be. You can use negative numbers.
Was there a reverse option? I don't recall.
That's a great question.
I think that was a diffuse thing.
I think so. I don't see it in the Antelope library. And I'm trying to remember because
if it's not too problematic to the API potentially.
Yeah, I know when you're calling get actions against the old history API, you could specify a negative number to get reverse order, but I don't remember if that works on the table calls. That's something we'll have to look into though. Like I'm dropping a comment right here because that's a really good use case. Like we do that in Anchor to get the token price. And I'm going to have to look, because I don't remember either, at how we do that. Like if we get the last row or the first row, but it is the most recent row. Like it's the most recent price. So cool. No, that's a really good test case. If there are other test cases like this where you're like, I need this one bit of data and I do this special query against the get table rows API call to get that data, and we can somehow abstract that into something even easier, like if it was Delphi Oracle first one, and that is actually what solves our problem, that would be great. But there might be special cases we haven't even thought of, just because there's so many ways to use this API.
Yeah, I have a ton of code I can go over, like from different random things.
Yeah.
And then look through the calls, like just do a quick search through get table rows and try to see if we have anything that could be useful for others, like a pattern of sorts that could be abstracted.
That would be much appreciated. We're kind of doing the same. That's why you see table calls we normally make in these test cases. But things that you guys on this call, or anybody that's watching this after the fact, all like 10 of you, might have, like, reach out, because we're really trying to make this so that it's flexible enough to fit all of those use cases and really simplify the, I didn't switch tabs again, simplifying how this is all done. So that way we have to write less boilerplate, because we all write a ton of boilerplate for these calls right now.
And less bugs, right? Like less code, less bugs, and better overall.
Yep. Cool. Well, we have hit the hour mark. I know people probably have to get going soon. This was good. I think this kind of helped us get our heads on in terms of direction, because we were going back and forth and definitely wanted to get some outside perspective on all of this. Is there anything else you guys or talk about, or anything before we wrap up this call?
I just wanted to add that this like new way or format, like where, for example, you allow .find, and then you still pass the first parameter, but then allows an optional, object. This gives you a lot of flexibility in the future.
Yeah.
Extra object could have a bunch of new fields that, support new features of API, for example.
Yeah. And this is even further out, that we might be able to leverage the same syntax for other API solutions, whether it be a history solution or like some database solution or anything like that. It's generic enough that maybe we can apply it to those things in the future as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, it seems like a decent point to wrap it up. This is probably going to be a topic that's still going to be ongoing for a little bit, just due to how complex it is and how many edge cases we're looking to cover with this. We'll probably be making this repo public in the not too distant future. I don't even honestly know why it was private to begin with. Maybe that was the default and we just never noticed. And then hopefully we can get some good discussions, an MVP out, so people can start playing with this and helping us find situations where we didn't consider something, and how this needs to be able to be applied to how applications use table data. So good stuff.
Yeah, I think the key is try to do it so that not necessarily have every, adaptation possible, but have it so that it's expandable in the future. I think that would be more important in general.
Yeah, good point, and very much agreed. So awesome. Well, thank you guys all very much for the ideas and contributions towards this. We will probably put our nose back in it and get this new syntax implemented, and then maybe do like a .1 release of the table structure. I guess real quick too, we also do have decent progress on the code generation side of things, where it will generate code based on your contracts, the ABIs and whatnot. So maybe in this 1.0.1 release, we can both have code generation and table querying, and use that as the launching point for iterating feedback and actual involvement where you get to play with it. So cool.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thanks, and we will do this again soon.